At the beginning of my Southern politics course, I ask students two deceptively simple questions. Why do we study the South? And is the South still distinctive? After all, the region has changed dramatically. The South is more urban and diverse, millions of Americans have migrated into the region, and many of the political differences that once separated the South from the rest of the country have narrowed. Yet, people continue to identify strongly as Southerners, and the South remains central to understanding American elections, race, political culture, and public policy. To help us think about whether the South still constitutes a distinctive political region, I am pleased to welcome Professor Chris Cooper of Western Carolina University. Professor Cooper studies Southern politics, state and local politics, elections, and public opinion. He is co author of The Resilience of Southern Identity: Why the South Still Matters in the Minds of Its People, and author of Anatomy of a Purple State, a North Carolina politics primer. Hello, I'm Marvin King, and this is Civic Lens. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. This will be fun.
Really looking forward to our discussion. So, Chris, I begin my Southern politics class with two questions. Why do we study the South? And is the South still distinctive? How would you answer those questions?
First of all, to say great minds think alike, because that's also how I start and end my Southern politics class is with those same questions.
Love to hear it.
Exactly. It's sort of the central puzzle, really, I think we should be dealing with. I tell the students the final exam question on the first day of class. The final exam question is, do we still need a Southern politics class? Or is Southern politics so perfectly integrated with the rest of the country that we should ditch the class? And then allow the students to sort of wrestle with that all semester. I do think the South is still unique, and I do think it still matters, although I do not penalize students who disagree with that take. There's a lot of ways to say, hey, maybe Southern distinctiveness is declining. And I think about just kind of what I see in the landscape, right? So, like if you're in Oxford, Mississippi, or you're in Asheville, North Carolina, or you're in Seattle, Washington, there's probably some outdoor mall that has the very same shops, right? You've got some of the same chain stores, you have much of the same media that we're consuming. And in terms of our politics, yeah, there are some ways to look at the South and say maybe it's not quite as distinct as it was. At the same time, I think regardless of what the causal mechanism is, Southern politics is still different, right? Now, maybe it's just a matter of the dynamics of who settled there, but they are fundamentally different. I also think that our history means that our politics are fundamentally different, right? We'll talk later, I think, about monuments and things like that. But clearly, those are discussions that take on a very different tenor in the rest of the country. You've got cultural differences. And what I found in some of my work, a lot of it with my pal Gibbs Knotts, is that when the South changes or when the world changes, in some ways that makes people identify with the region even more, right? So if you're trapped in strip mall hell, right, what do you want? You want a connection to place. And so it's sort of counterintuitive in some ways that the times and the places we think the region and connection to place would be disappearing, that we find that people actually connect to it even more.
I hear at Ole Miss, we're an SEC school, and
Mhm.
that seems to link that southeastern distinctiveness. That is something that then connects, right? So, like you say, suburban strip malls are all the same, but something that people really care about around here, college athletics, they've got that to kind of distinguish themselves. Let me ask you this: so, suppose one of my students argued that national partisan polarization has essentially swallowed Southern distinctiveness, politically speaking, so that a Mississippi Republican and an Ohio Republican now have more politically in common than Mississippians might have with one another. How would you respond to that in terms of thinking of the South as a distinct political region?
I think we have overlapping identities, right? Of course, partisanship is going to swallow a lot. I mean, there's no question that that is true. But that doesn't also mean that being a Mississippian doesn't matter to people in Mississippi and that it doesn't shape people's worldviews. And it doesn't mean that the things you're actually experiencing in everyday life and the media that you're consuming, and heck, even the football games you're going to and that you're obsessed with, like all of that affects your life as well. So I don't know that it's an either or. And I don't think we should really be in search of an either or, right? So if we think about just our friends in the history department for a second, they fight a lot over whether, ultimately the struggle of American politics is more about race or class. My answer is kind of like, well, why do we need to say it's about race or class, right? Race and class are intertwined in some really interesting and important ways. and that both can be exercising at the same time, just like gender, just like all of these other identifiers that people have.
That's right. Political scientists love to talk about interaction effects. And it brings up to me your work in the resilience of Southern identity. And so, thinking about the significance that identity still carries, is it as simple as people identifying as a Mississippian or a Floridian? What does Southern identity mean?
Yeah, it means something different to different people, right? Which is frustrating in some ways, right? As a social scientist, we like simple and clean explanations that we can model easily, and I certainly like those as much as any other social scientist. But I don't know that it always works the same way. So what we show in the book, we show a few different things. One, we show that Southern identity is, as the title suggests, resilient, right? It's held fairly steady over time. Where you would think, in some ways, I would have thought that it will be declining for all those reasons that we talked about at the top. The world looks more the same. It's the same media. Some of these partisanship patterns have swallowed regional politics, but yet it still seems to hold. And what's hidden in that story, I think, is a lot of interesting things. One is about race. So if you look at when John Shelton Reed first started measuring Southern identity in the early 1970s, I think he did it first in a book called Southerners in 1972, he found a pretty big racial disparity, right? So he found that whites in the South are much more likely to identify as Southerners than people of color in the South and blacks in the South. And what we found now is that whites and blacks who live in the South, geographic Southerners, we call them, identify at roughly the same levels. As a matter of fact, black Southerners may even be slightly more likely to identify as Southerners than whites who live in the South. And so it's this resilient story, but hidden under that is this really interesting racial movement that I think is defining a lot of the South and the way we think about the South. And sort of my big critique of the and I'm not alone in this, but one of my critiques of Southern politics literature is that too often folks have sort of used whites synonymous with Southerners. And John Shelton Reed actually was as guilty as anybody of doing that. Frequently, he would write books about Southerners, but it was really just a book about white Southerners. There's even some new books by some really good scholars that will be about some aspect of the South, but it's really just about white Southerners. And if the concept means something, then it's got to mean something that cuts across more than just one race.
It makes me think of the tremendous demographic change in the South over the last 30 or 40 years. Migration, urbanization, the metropolitan areas are as big as anywhere now, and increasing racial and ethnic diversity. I grew up in South Texas, so you always had a large Latino population. And so that has changed the South. Getting back to thinking about Southern identity, is it the case that people change the South or does the South change them?
I think about the cheesy meme from a couple years ago, why not both, right? And I think that's sort of what's going on here. I do think the two interact with each other. I think people are changing the South. So Erwin Morris at NC State has a great book called Movers and Stayers, and his thesis is about Southerners, and it's pretty. So he puts it right there in the title. People who move in the South are much more likely to be left leaning, much more likely to be liberal, but Democratic. And people who stay put, stay where they grew up, and are places that are dominated by stayers are much more conservative, right? So you can sort of see both things happening at once, I think, in Irwin's book. You can see the place acting on the people and the people acting on the place. And I think they both do occur at the same time. There's no question that it's a changing South, but yet many of our, kind of old debates are still here. And I think sort of layer one more thing on top of that, which is you don't have to live in the South even to identify as a Southerner. So we use these sort of vignettes at the beginning of our book to talk about all these different folks who think of themselves as Southerners, and they're very different people. But one of them that we highlight is a guy named Patterson Hood, who is a lead singer of a band called Drive By Truckers. This very kind of loud rock and roll band from the South. He now lives in Portland, Oregon, but he still writes songs about the South, and I think and writes New York Times op-eds about the South, and his dad was part of the Muscle Shoals sound that changed the shape of American popular music from the South, and so I think it's really sort of fascinating as we think about it is identity is a social psychological construct, right? But geography is something different.
I was driving through rural Connecticut one time and I saw the largest Confederate battle flag painted on the side of a barn as I have ever seen. And I remember reading a book called The Confederate Battle Flag and learning about how in the 1980s, the solidarity movement in Poland adopted, like, because it meant rebel to
Mhm.
them.
Yep.
And that identity of we are fighting the system or fighting the status quo. Term that I want to talk about next, memory and what we mean by the politics of Southern memory and might how might it relate to say our disputes over uh, Confederate statuary monuments.
Yeah, absolutely. The politics of Southern memory is sort of a phrase that is about that very battle, right? So the way we think about the Civil War, the way we think about why monuments are there, the way we think about the past is shaping our political fights in the present. And so, I mean, obviously, Ole Miss is no stranger to these kinds of conversations, right? I mean, my understanding of the history is folks at Ole Miss started flying the Confederate flag when Strom Thurmond was running for office under the Dixiecrat ticket, right? It was not there before. It was a political movement that essentially just held. And so the way people think about how we got here and why we got here is, I think, playing out daily. I live in this tiny little town in Appalachia called Sylva, North Carolina. And we got this gorgeous courthouse at the top of the hill. They've turned into a library, and there's a Confederate monument in front of it, like I'm sure your students are very familiar with. I find that monument fascinating for a lot of reasons. We've had a bunch of fights over it, which are similar to the rest of the country. But I started doing some research on the history of this monument and when it was put up. And of course, like most of these, it was put up right after the Civil War ended. And it was sort of this tour that folks would take, and they'd put up Confederate monuments around the South, around North Carolina. The statue itself was made in Ohio, which is always a hilarious story. But the point I'm getting to politically is I was sort of going back through, and in the 1980s, they refurbished the statue. They, just like you would refurbish any statue. The person who raised the money and was the big political donor for this was a local Democrat who actually served in our state legislature. And the center that I now run is actually named after him, a guy named Phil Hare. Now, when we have these fights, it's Democrats anti and it's Republicans for the most part. And so I think that just shows like how quickly some of these things actually change. And it's all so you say, how can they change over a static statue? And the answer is the politics of Southern memory, right? The ways in which the way people think about and remember the past is changing how they're acting on the present.
I think of the George Floyd's protest in 2020. We had a statue here on campus that moved it. We have a Confederate cemetery on campus. And so they took it out of the central part of location at the circle and moved it. It's basically hidden at our Confederate cemetery. But then we also have one on the town square, which remained, and the supervisors 5-0 voted to keep it. The same community had two very different reactions. You've studied Southern accents in political campaigns, and I love this. Question is, what can something seemingly minor as an accent tell us about identity and how we evaluate candidates and how voters might perceive someone as authentically Southern or Virginian? And I remember many years ago when George W. Bush was running for president, and a lot of other Republicans, their campaign ad, it was real politics of personality, was I'm a George W. Bush Republican. And I could have sworn some of them had a thicker drawl
Mhm.
in those commercials. They really managed to find the twang hidden somewhere.
Mhm.
I'm curious about what you found about how accents can affect our politics.
Yeah, this was a really fun project. We actually paid some act first time my career doing all sorts of usually quantitative research on stuff that we're paying actors. And so we would pay these actors to read the same speech, Southern accent, non-Southern accent. And I guess maybe I'll get to why we thought it'd be interesting. First, things like race and gender, yes, cues are sometimes wrong, but people often get visual cues, right? About race or about gender, about other identifiers. But southernness is something that is harder to identify from visual cues, right? So how do you do it? You do it through auditory cues. You do it through an accent. And so we got really interested in the types of cues and what that might actually mean for voters. And if we think actually right now, I think playing out in Texas, you got me thinking maybe less about the accent, but this whole argument about whether James Tallarico is a vegan, right? I mean, this is ultimately about identity. It's about connection to place and connection to region. So we thought, well, let's just test this out with the accent. And our hypotheses were essentially that people, particularly from the non South, would think that Southerners were dumber and that Southerners were also a little more honest and perhaps not quite as electable. And essentially, that's what we found. That wasn't what was surprising. What was a little surprising to me was this sort of penalty of accent on intelligence also worked for Southerners. In other words, Southerners thought that people who sounded like Southerners were a little dumber on average. And I thought this is just fascinating. I mean, it's a simple cue, but you do, right? So somebody has a certain accent or a certain way of speaking, and it does affect in a lot of ways how you perceive them and how you perceive electability and all these other factors. So I think we're not arguing for a second that this is, the most important cue in a campaign. We are arguing it as one, it is one that can cue place and authenticity in a very specific way.
Well, I promise you, and I'm sure North Carolina is the same, especially for your state legislative elections that are low budget and the advertising is through the radio, that voice really does carry a long way. And you can pick out a local and people, I'm not tooting my own horn, I promise you, people have asked me, uh, Marvin, Dr. King, why don't you run for office? And I'm like, I would never get elected here in a million years because I do not sound like I'm from here. And I think that really does go a long way. That's just anecdotal, of course, but it's nice to see the research in how people really can connect, and that's part of that identity. You can tell right away if somebody is from your area or not, and that is going to potentially affect how you evaluate them. Another group that a lot of research has been done is MAGA Republicans within the Southern electorate. So now that we're getting towards the tail end of the Trump era, and this is probably a question that maybe you would give a different answer 4 years ago or 6 years ago than maybe now or 5 years from now. So, MAGA, is it simply the latest manifestation of Southern conservatism? In my class, I'll talk about the Tea Party.
Mhm,
We'll talk about that movement, and then we'll also go back and talk about the moral majority
mhm.
and different kind of groups that have had tremendous influence over time. So, would we think of MAGA as just the latest manifestation of Southern conservatism, or is it meaningfully different?
Yeah, I think it's a different flavor. Not fundamentally, it's not opposite or anything, but it's much more it's focused around a person, right? We use the phrase America first for a very long time, despite what President Trump says. That word's been around for much longer than I've been alive, and I'm in my 50s. But MAGA started with President Trump. It's about President Trump. It is a populist movement inherently. I think it is much more akin in that ways to the kinds of people that VO Key talked about in Southern politics and state and nation, right? These old populist, at that time, Democratic leaders. I think that's what we're seeing with the MAGA movement. So I think it is a little bit different, or it's the next stage. I'm not saying that these people might have different, they probably have the same policy opinions, but MAGA is not about policy. MAGA is about identity and a movement. And I think that's kind of what we're trying to show in that piece.
I'm not sure that anybody else has the personal magnetism with the core MAGA voters that Trump does. I completely agree with you. It's individualized. We have a good number of students now here at Ole Miss from North Carolina, and I find North Carolina such an interesting case study because it exemplifies so many things. You've got your big urban areas, you've got several of them, you've got your highly educated electorate, you also have your rural areas, you have your parts of far western North Carolina that going all the way back to the Civil War were the mountain Republicans that really did not want to become Democrats. You've got the coastal areas. So I find North Carolina, you have a little bit of everything. And you've had some of the most competitive and expensive and weird political races over the last 10 years. So it's often described as a purple state. What can North Carolina teach us about the broader political transformations taking place across the South?
I think a ton. I'm so lucky. North Carolina is such an interesting place to not just study politics, but to, as a friend of mine says, be obsessed with the same reality TV show, which is to say American politics, right? And Southern politics. It's fascinating. So I think one of the things North Carolina shows, well, sort of 10,000 foot view, I think North Carolina shows us what American politics looks like perfectly distilled. right? And that's some of the argument I try to make in the book. We're a very divided country, right? We're talking about the United States Senate could come down to one seat, one way or the other, right? The House is probably going to flip, but not by very much. We're incredibly divided. We're polarized, all that stuff that we know well. Well, you see it all in North Carolina, right? We have a Democratic governor. We've never had a Republican attorney general in the history of the state of North Carolina, but our Republican state legislature passes some of the most conservative policies in the country. One thing it shows us is just that, what it looks like distilled, which can be pretty ugly. I think one thing we see is that in a purple state, you might like to think, I might like to think that we'd have more moderate policies. I think you actually sort of see the opposite because when you get power, you need to exert it quickly or you might lose it. This is sort of akin to the way Francis Lee talks about it, insecure majorities, sometimes congressional majorities work. It also shows us what the rural transformation of the South can mean for a state's politics. So places like Charlotte, like the Research Triangle, Asheville, Wilmington growing constantly, right? So a lot of people have said, well, North Carolina is going to be the next Virginia. It's going to go very blue because of these places. But the difference is North Carolina still has a lot of rural places. It has the second most rural voters of any state in the country after Texas. And so those two forces are pushing against each other. And 20 years ago, that wouldn't have given us the same answer. So Seth McKee and Trey Hood have a really good book about the rural Republican realignment. And essentially what they argue is that the notion that, rural places are Republican and urban places are Democrat is fairly recent. And it was sort of the last piece of the Southern realignment. And so you can see that in North Carolina perfectly. Our cities are going bluer and bluer. Our urban or rural places, are going redder and redder. And so where we're meeting is this kind of loggerhead, competitive, fascinating, and frustrating state.
The battles are in the suburbs, or is it just about turnout?
Yes, and the battles are in the suburbs very much, but it's also about turnout. Former Governor Roy Cooper, no relation, is now running for Senate in North Carolina. And so I went back recently trying to figure out, okay, well, how did that guy win on all these tickets where Trump won? So people say, well, it's a lot like Andy Beshear in Kentucky, who's a Democrat who wins in a Republican state, but it's not because they have off year elections for their governor. Roy Cooper's winning on the same ballot as these Republicans. And the answer I found was different than I thought I'd find. I thought what I would find is that Roy Cooper does better in rural areas than other Democrats. What I found was the opposite. He does better in urban areas. He doubles down where Democrats do best. It is very much a turnout game, much more so than a persuasion game.
That tells me he probably runs a well-oiled political campaign operation, probably has great professionals working for him. You've recently become involved in North Carolina's efforts to modernize its election data systems. How has working directly with election administrators changed or influenced kind of how you've thought about how elections work?
Yeah, I love this question. It has improved every part of my thinking about politics. And so, with this, they call it the Meds Commission, where we're trying to get this new election system. I've also become, in recent years, a lot more involved with various groups that work with election administrators and some of these political science side groups. But also, last weekend, actually, I was in Kansas City at the Election Center Conference, which is where all the election administrators get together from across the country to talk about things. It has really improved and sharpened my thinking. It's given me more faith in the electoral system, but it's also given me more research questions than I can possibly imagine. So for the political scientists, sometimes I feel like, why should I, listen to practitioners? One, because it'll make you better at what you do, make you a better teacher. But also it just sharpens your mind and you listen. And if you're a thoughtful person, then you start thinking, wow, I hadn't really thought about that particular angle. I want to know if the world works this way as a certain reason. And I'll give you one very substantive example of that. I was a poll worker a few cycles ago, and I try to be every time. And I noticed as our students would come in to be registered to vote, same day registration, the poll workers would be so sweet. And they would say, hey, honey, let's get you registered. If you register as unaffiliated, you can vote in any primary you want. And the students say, that sounds pretty good. And they'd say, now I'm supposed to ask your race, but you don't actually have to give me that information. The student would say, I don't want to. Well, so there was that side of me. And then the other political scientist side of me combs through voter files a lot, sometimes for litigation work, sometimes for other kinds of work. And I started noticing more and more and more missing data. And then I put the two pieces together and said, I bet there's a ton more missing data from same day registrations. And I bet we're going to see variation across counties based on how poll workers are thinking about their jobs. So I wrote a paper with a friend of mine about that. And that's exactly what we found. And so I think it's really helped sharpen my thinking, help keep this really fun, and I hope fun for another 25 or so years.
We could obviously talk all semester about these subjects, and in fact, we do. And to close, I always like to encourage listeners to continue learning. And so, if one of my students wanted to better understand Southern identity or contemporary politics, I'm certainly going to include the links to your books here in the show notes. Anything else that you would recommend for someone who wants to learn more about any of the topics we've talked about today?
I mean, so many. I'll book in two, right? So everybody, I'm sure in your class they're reading VOK's Southern Politics and State and Nation, and I think that still makes so much sense for folks to read. And I think for us to remember as political scientists, that was actually a book that really was ultimately about election administration and the poll tax at first, right? And then it turned into this other thing. There's so much in that book. And when I say book in, so that when we're back to 1949, go to the most current thing I can think of, which is a book that comes out next month about what the decline and the death, the stripping of the Voting Rights Act has meant for America, called An American Problem, that's coming out with Princeton University Press. And it's extraordinary work. And if you ever wondered why the Voting Rights Act matters and why the Voting Rights Act going away matters, I think that's the book to read.
I'm looking forward to reading that as well. Every time I teach this class, every 2 or 3 years, something has changed. And we just had Louisiana versus Calais. Before that, there was Shelby County versus Holder. And speaking of North Carolina, all of the North Carolina related redistricting cases, there's just been so many important, critical redistricting cases. So, yes, another example of how North Carolina is just in the thick of it all. Once again, we've had Professor Chris Cooper from Western Carolina University on Civic Lens today. I really appreciate your time and all of your insights. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. Really hope you enjoyed the episode. Help us reach more people by subscribing to the podcast and sharing this episode. Leave a comment too, that really helps. Thank you and have a great day.